Good afternoon, Terps. My name is Jeff Williams, the Associate Executive Director for Alumni Engagement and Outreach at the University of Maryland Alumni Association. We're glad you're able to join us for today's webinar on how to maximize your millennial talent at work. This session is part of the Alumni Association's Professional Development Webinar Series, where we hope to provide thought-provoking and valuable content that will help alumni like you achieve your personal and professional goals. Past topics have included Spring into Action, a series on financial wellness, best practices in working with a recruiter, and grow your sales in the Amazon Marketplace, among other topics. During the webinar, we encourage you to use the chat box to share any thoughts, questions, or comments you might have for the presenter. Questions throughout the session, and our presenter will answer them as often as possible. And who is our presenter? Today we are joined by David Shar, University of Maryland alumnus and founder of Illuminate PMC. Through his company, David offers a refreshing philosophy on leadership, organizational culture, and performance management. David uses his extensive education in HR management and industrial organizational psychology, along with over 15 years of management experience, to teach and inspire people from all levels within an organization. David helps business owners and managers simultaneously create a more positive, passionate, and profitable work environment. With that, I'll turn it over to David.
Thank you so much, Jeff, and thank you all for being here. So let me give you a quick, just very brief background on me beyond what Jeff said, and this is all relevant. I recently was at a lecture where the lecture started with, let me tell you about me. That took about 45 minutes, and then he talked about his topic for 5. So I'm not going to do that to you, I promise. But as Jeff said, I am an alum of UMD, specifically the IO Master's Program, the IO Psychology, that's Industrial Organizational Psychology. If you geek out on stuff like millennial stuff and motivating employees, I highly recommend that you check it out. My work background is primarily in retail, food service, leadership positions within that service industry. And working within that industry is kind of interesting. So what it does is it introduces you to a lot of younger workers, and you also have to get creative with how you motivate those workers, because you're not really able to incentivize with cash much more than the minimum wage. So that work experience really primed me to how do you get creative with motivation for millennials and all younger workers and all workers in general. My education is in HR management. Like I said, at the University of Maryland, the Industrial Organizational Psychology program, and right now I'm a doctoral student in business psychology at a different university that I will not name, but believe me, it's not as great as the University of Maryland, although it is great. Anyway, so today we are here to talk about how to maximize your millennial talent at work. Let's talk about this because it is an extremely hot topic right now. Millennials are something that we've been talking about for a while and that we seem to be obsessing over. For those of you not familiar with Google Ngram, Google took, I believe it was over 5 million books and codified them, searching for all these different words and terms, and you can go on Google and sort of search this out and see how often these terms showed up in literature over the years. Unfortunately, Google only did this through 2008 at the moment. But when you type in millennials, you can see the first time millennials were coined in book form was around 1991, and that's definitely illustrated on this graph. But what's really interesting is that from the get-go, we really started talking about millennials. Once we moved on from calling them Gen Y, we started talking about millennials, and what happened was you see the uptick right there around the year 2000, when the millennials, the oldest millennials, first entered college, and we started really worrying about this generation that was coming up and was about to enter the workforce. You then see that around 2004, 2005, when the oldest millennials started graduating college and full on entering the workforce, we went into a sheer panic. If you look at the mentions of millennials, and that only goes through 2008. I can tell you that I am very often asked to speak about millennials and asked to consult with people about how to deal with their millennial employees. So I assure you that this didn't dip back down after 2008, and instead we continue to obsess over our millennial employees and talk about them a whole lot. The question is, though, exactly what are we saying about them when we're talking about them? So I pulled a couple peer-reviewed articles with interesting titles about millennials. Here's a couple for you to look at. How to keep millennial employees from becoming ex-employees. Millennials at work. Why the office will never be the same. Work life. Is the boomer millennial war over? As you can see here, and maybe in your experience, the things we're saying about millennials are not necessarily glowing things. In fact, it represents this panic. We're talking about ex-employees. Work will never be the same. We're using words like war. It seems a bit dramatic, to me anyway, but I don't know what your experiences are with your millennials. I would love to learn a little bit more about your ideas or your perceptions of your millennial workers. So if you could, go into that chat box right there on the right side of your screen, unless you moved it around, and just type in 1 or 2 adjectives to describe your millennial workers. I'm really interested to see whether you are experiencing the same things as these research articles suggest. So I'll give you a second if anybody's brave enough to type something in there. All right, I'm not seeing anything in the chat box, so I am going to, they care about flexibility. Yep, definitely care about flexibility, and that's a really nice thing to say about millennials. But I feel like maybe people here are very pro-millennial, or maybe they're not brave enough to say what's actually on their mind about millennials, because especially when I get into situations behind closed doors with employers, the things they say about millennials are not so nice. Some of the things that I regularly hear about millennials, they're odd, just purposefully odd. They're anti-establishment, anti-authority, rabble-rousers, lazy. I'm sure you guys have heard this, and I am curious as to whether there are millennials logged in right now who have heard themselves or their cohort being referred to as lazy, antisocial, glued to their cell phones, narcissistic as well. Millennials are just this bunch of people that are obsessed with their avocado toast. That's what I'm hearing about millennials, and it's part of that panic. So the question is, how accurate is all of this? So there is a obsessed with cell phone, absolutely. There is this perception about millennials out there, and I'm not sure that this is a very helpful thing for this perception to be out there. Some studies do back up the fact that millennials are the most narcissistic generational cohort, ever. So maybe there is some truth behind some of these stereotypes, but all the same, these are stereotypes. And I would like to give a disclaimer at this point. It's very dangerous to make assumptions about individuals based on the group that they belong to. We sort of feel free to do that about millennials, but that's where the disclaimer comes in. We wouldn't feel comfortable having a webinar like this about, especially talking about these negative connotations about African American workers or female workers or Jewish workers. It would feel really yucky. It would feel wrong and legally to discriminate against any sort of group like that would be illegal. But somehow millennials are different. And in fact, millennials are different even legally. So Title VII protects all races. It protects all sexes. It protects all religions. But when it comes to age discrimination, it's the one thing that I'm aware of where we can't discriminate against people for being old. You can't discriminate against somebody for being 40 years old or older, but there's no law protecting people from being discriminated against for being under 40. In other words, I can freely say, and I don't suggest this, I am not a lawyer, but I don't suggest this, but I can freely say, or much more freely say, I don't hire anybody under 25 years old because I feel like they're not responsible. But I could never say I'm not hiring anybody over 40 or over 60 because they work too slow or whatever. That would not be okay legally. And so for whatever reason, we have this differential with millennials where as a society, we've decided that it's okay to be critical about these millennial employees and openly critical about these millennial employees. So my disclaimer is to not judge them as individuals. However, it is super useful to think about them as a cohort and super useful to think about how to motivate your younger workers because that is a true concern in business. And if we can create some general policies to help us with that, that will be very beneficial for us. But let me introduce you to some other millennials that may or may not fit your stereotype. Here we've got Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook, millennial. Pete Buttigieg, the guy, you know, he's going to be president one day maybe. He's a millennial. I think our first millennial presidential candidate. We've got Beyonce, the Queen Bee, is a millennial. And whether you're obsessed with her music or not, she is a brand unto herself. And there's me, David Shar. I just wanted to be in a slide with Beyonce, but I am a millennial. In fact, I'm one of the oldest millennials. So here I am. I've been an employer. I've been a manager. I like to think that I have work ethic. I honestly don't think I have ever had a slice of avocado toast in my life, and yet I'm classified as a millennial. So even with that hairline, by the way, and this picture is flattering. My hairline is not quite as full as it is even in this picture. So exactly what makes me a millennial? What makes Beyonce, Mark Zuckerberg, what makes us millennials? Well, the thing about these generational cohorts is all you need to be a part of that cohort is to be born in a window of a certain amount of years. And there's disagreement on where the cutoffs are, but typically they're somewhere around 10 to 20 years. So a millennial, according to Pew Research, which is one of the most cited, has one of the most cited views on where the generational divides and cutoffs are. According to Pew Research, millennial is anyone born between 1981 and 1996. So if you're doing the math, the oldest millennials are turning 37, 38, 39 years old, almost 40 years old within the next year or so. I honestly couldn't tell you how old I am. I've got 4 kids, so after like the 3rd, I stopped counting my birthdays. Anyway, so what I'd like to know is what generation each of you belong to. So we've got a poll here, and this should pop up on the side. And we're going to ask you to just select which generation you belong to according to Pew Research. So silent generation, these are the people that they make up a very small percentage of the workforce now. We're looking at anywhere between 1928 and 1945. You boomers out there were born between 1946 and 1964. Gen X, 1965 to 1980, Millennials 1981 to 1996, and the iGen, or Generation Z, which has a bit of a negative connotation to it because what comes next? Nothing. So I prefer to call them the I generation. They are 1997, typically born 1997 or beyond. So we didn't get a whole bunch of responses on the poll, but I am wondering whether you are shocked about which generational cohort you belong in. Typically, when I give talks on millennials, there's a handful of people in the room almost every time that are shocked to find out that they're a millennial, because we talk so negatively about millennials and they're always thinking about them as those kids. And then you get these people in their mid to upper 30s who are shocked to see that they are actually considered as part of that cohort. And they immediately come up to me after my lecture and try to distance themselves from that label, which is always kind of interesting. This whole millennial thing is really kind of important because when you look at the representation in the workplace right now, millennials have actually, as of 2015, they outpaced Gen Xers and are now the largest generational group in the US workforce. That means that they are significant in your life, in your work life. You can either learn to work with them, to lead them, or in many cases, to be led by them, or you can become irrelevant fairly quickly. Millennials, while we're looking at 37% in 2015, that number has already risen and is going to continue to rise as the boomers continue to retire and millennials continue to enter the workforce. You poor Gen Xers out there, there are not many of you. That Gen X is a very small generation, and so they kind of are going to be squeezed out by these millennials. And that's why it is so important to understand this generation, or understand what it means to understand this generation. So we've got this huge generation. We're talking about them like crazy. We're flipping out. We are so scared of what it means with this generation taking over the workforce. They've got crazy ideas. They're attached to their technology. They're lazy. They have no work ethic, according to some. And this is all new. We've never experienced anything like this before, right? Well, maybe not. Now, if we go back to that Google Ngram, but we type in Gen X, what we find is something remarkably similar to what we found with millennials. Back in the 1990s, we started talking about Gen X a whole lot. And on this graph, you see on that red line, you see the uptick when Gen X entered college and the additional uptick when they started to enter the workforce. Gen X impacted us in very similar ways. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're probably thinking, well, they didn't even touch the millennial hysteria. And you're right. And I would give you two reasons for that. One, Gen X, like I said, was a much smaller cohort. So even as they were entering the workforce, there wasn't much of a threat for them to overtake the boomers as quickly as the millennials did. Two, we didn't have the same sort of hysteria in the media and social media back in the 1990s as we do today. Instead, with the millennials, this is something that just is keeping alive because there's so many reminders of this millennial issue, whereas with Gen X, we didn't necessarily have that. But everything old is new again. Now, what are we saying about Gen X? It's I do have a confession. So earlier I showed you a slide of peer-reviewed articles talking about millennials. I wasn't being completely honest with you. In fact, those peer-reviewed articles were not talking about millennials, and they weren't published in 2017, 2018. Those articles were actually published in 1998, 2000, and they were about Gen X employees. So we were saying how to keep Gen X employees from becoming X employees, why the office will never be the same, work life, is the boomer Gen X war over? We were freaking out about these Gen X employees the same way we are today freaking out about the millennial employees. And by the way, people are starting to freak out about the iGen employees. Nothing is new here. So while there are issues in how we motivate our younger workers, perhaps we're looking at this wrong, and it has less to do with millennials per se and more to do with younger workers entering the workplace and with them bringing in technological changes and changes in attitudes. This is not new. And if you want to say that the rhetoric may be the same, or that I cherry pick these little titles, you can say that, but let's take a look at the hard data. There's very little hard data out there, unfortunately, these longitudinal studies where we can compare apples to apples, but there are some. And when we look at those studies, it turns out that things tend to be very familiar. This graph shows Gen X in 2000, millennials in 2016. So this is a measurement in 2000 and a measurement in 2016 of tenure, how long somebody would stick around in a job, of people between 25 and 34 years old. And this is right from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So in 2000, they asked the question, how long have you been employed in your current occupation? And how long have you been employed in your current occupation? And in 2016, they asked the same question. Now, the interesting thing is the people in that 25 to 34 year old range back in 2000 were what we today call Gen Xers. But obviously in 2016, those people would be millennials. So when you look at 5-year tenure, it was almost exactly the same. When you look at 13-month tenure, in other words, who stuck around their job for just at least, or just over a year at least, you find that millennials have had a longer tenure. In other words, over 60% of millennials have stuck around in their current job for more than a year compared to Gen X, which was slightly below that 60% number. So when we compare apples to apples, we start to see that maybe this has more to do with younger workers and is a universal problem that is not new. And maybe it has a little bit less to do with the fact that there is something significantly different and or scary about these millennial employees. Also, from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, if you look across the board, when they were looking at tenure, and they were looking to see people who had stuck around their job for 10 years or more. So tenure in a company for 10 years or more. What you find is that 10-year tenure, that's people sticking around for a long time. 10-year tenure of a 35 to 39-year-old has not budged. It was 23% in January 2008, and it was 25.7% in 2018. That is no change whatsoever. Let's go on right here. We're looking at generational cohorts as surveyed by college students. So this is another one of those rare longitudinal studies, meaning they studied the same thing 3 separate times across over a decade. So in 1995, they asked college students to decide whether something was critically important or very important when they were selecting a place to work. They then did this again in 2004, and they did it again in 2013. So they're always asking college students who are about to enter the workforce. So always the same age, but in 1995, those college students were Gen Xers. In 2004 and 2013, they were millennials. And what you see is that nothing has changed, or very little has changed, besides for leadership opportunity, which for some reason took a dip. But what you see is, of these 5 qualities, all of them remained in the same order of importance in terms of the percentage of these college students who found them important. Career advancement was always, since the 1995 study, had been consistently the most important thing for young workers. And flexible work policies was also critically important, but not quite as much, only about 20-something%, and always always the least of the 5. So what this shows is, what's really interesting about this graph is that from 2004 to 2013, you actually see a bigger difference than you do from 1995 to 2004. You see a larger growth, a larger spike forward. What's interesting about that is that the years in between 2004 and 2013 were, of course, when we got hit by the Great Recession. So perhaps the economy and all the things that came with that Great Recession had an impact on workplace attitudes. But that again makes you question, why are we lumping these generations in these cohorts of 10 or 20 years? It seems like it's just very random. What we do notice, the last thing that'll point out about this graph, is that we do notice that more and more people are ranking all of these as critically important. So people are demanding more from their work environment as time goes on. But they are demanding the same types of things in the same general order. So these are really interesting things that suggest to us that maybe the whole generational idea, the idea that these generations are unique from each other is not so accurate, and instead instead this has a lot more to do with your stage in the workplace. And millennials, when they get to be the boomers ages and they're 60 years old, might have very different values, very similar values to boomers, values not so similar to where they are now. So at that, I'd like to pause for a second and see if we have any questions. I'll give you guys a second in that question box if you wanted to submit any. And Jeff, you can let me know if we've got any questions.
Hey, David, yeah, we do got one in here. It says, besides for age and stage of life, what would influence the difference between generations?
Yeah, Jeff. So that's a great question. So there's a lot out there that suggests, like I showed on the last slide, that perhaps these big world events, like the Great Recession, would influence a change in attitudes. The other thing is that we have technology that's constantly coming out. So when you say that millennials, they don't want to be in the workplace, they don't want work to be the center of their universe, like older generations want, maybe that is an accurate difference of the generations, but baby boomers didn't really have the tools to provide them with more work-life balance. They didn't have tools for telework. They didn't have the internet and cell phones that they could work from the beach. So those changes in technology can certainly influence changes in the way that these cohorts and what these cohorts are looking for, and change in their attitudes.
Great, thank you. We've got one more as well here. My younger employees are much different than I've ever seen before. So how can you say generational differences don't exist?
Yeah, and that too is a great question, and I think it is very similar to the answer is very similar to the last question, which is that these generations oftentimes are blamed. The younger workers are sort of blamed for bringing in these new attitudes and these new technologies. Change is hard, and so if you are within an organization, you're working in an organization for decades, and suddenly now we have computer internet access and cell phones and all of those sorts of things that we can rely on to work from the beach or to work at our own hours. When those things are changing over time, if you already know that you like to be in the office by 8 in the morning and out by 5, and that's how you've been doing it for decades, now you have tools that can help you work in a different way. You might be a little bit resistant to that change. But the newer workers who are entering the workplace with these new technologies don't even have that original mindset about what work is supposed to be. So instead, these newer workers come in with expectations that they've grown up with, that they can work on their own, that they do have a cell phone in their pocket with Siri, who has all of the answers that they could ever need. So why should they have to rely on you, the boss, dictating to them how something is done? They can look it up. So there are definitely changes that come with the technology, and the question is, are they the fault of that generation coming in, or is that generation just ushering in a change and then being blamed for the change that they're bringing?
Great, and we just have another question here. What does this say about our social and political leadership?
What does it say about our social and political leadership? That's a great question. I wonder what context the person is referring to. If they could clarify that real quick.
Sure. So if I think that was Noreen, if you'd like to have a follow-up to that. And David, we can get back to there are a few other questions that have come in, but we can maybe get back to them at the second half of the questions.
Okay, that sounds great. Okay. All right, so we'll move on and I'll come back to the question, Noreen, don't let me forget. All right, so maybe it's time to start rethinking how we motivate people. Maybe this issue with millennials does have something to do with where we are as a society. Maybe it has something to do with us being so stuck in our old ways. I assume that many of you are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you've taken an intro to psych course or anything like that, you've probably been exposed to Maslow at some point. And Maslow, he gets a lot of hate nowadays. People are very critical about his theory, but I think Maslow sort of got it right when I look at how my clients and how the workplace in general is structured, and how these employers are trying to motivate their employees. So Maslow, just to run through, he has this hierarchy of needs, and his concept is that as each one of these layers is fulfilled, these motives are fulfilled, you can move on from there. You've sort of maxed out there, and now the individual can turn their attention to the more senior and then more intrinsic motivator. What you see with Maslow is that he starts with physiological needs. In the workplace, that could easily be translated to your paycheck. So physiological needs means, do you have a roof over your head and do you have food on your table? Are you being taken care of at the most basic level? Maslow then moves up to safety, a security. So in today's work environment, perhaps that's literally safety, which we have OSHA now that protects us in the workplace. We have a lot of standards that protect us in the workplace, but also can be tied to job security, that you want to know that your next meal is covered. And we do have social safety nets now that help us with this. We're not perfect. There isn't everything out there, but I would say that in terms of the physiological and safety needs, we are more covered than we've ever been. So physiologically, through our paycheck, we have minimum wage, which is not a living wage by any means, but many of you in this webinar are probably managing employees who are being paid a living wage. In fact, some of the research shows us that after $75,000, that's an estimate, $75,000 is the magic number, that if you hit that number, additional income does not increase your emotional well-being. Kind of interesting. So we might be capped out in terms of Maslow, who said you just have to sort of hit the minimum standards. We might have done that already with the physiological needs as well as the safety needs, because today, if you are laid off today, we've got so many things, social structures to help you out. We have the gig economy. You could be driving for Uber tomorrow. And while I am not in any way saying that there isn't suffering out there, that there aren't people that are starving out there, what I am saying is that for a large portion of the population, we're better off now than we have been in the past. And yet, these employers who have employees who are being paid a minimum wage, who do have this job security, these employers, when they see that their employees are not sticking around, that their turnover is high, that people aren't performing, what they do is they just continue to throw money at the problem. And that is a big issue and seems like a complete waste of money to me. And it also seems like they're missing the point, because once you move on from the physiological and the safety concerns, Maslow moves into the more intrinsic motivators, and those include a sense of belonging, which in the workplace aligns with millennials asking for community and support. It works into esteem, where millennials are asking for autonomy and growth. And then eventually you hit self-actualization, and what you hear these younger workers always talking about is finding meaning in their work. They want purpose in their work. And so instead of throwing dollars at the problem and just, what's the definition of craziness, doing the same thing and expecting different results, right? So why are we continuing to throw money at those bottom two rungs? I would argue it's because of laziness, because those two bottom rungs, it's extrinsic. These top layers take a little bit more thought and take a little bit more work on the employer's side, and they require the employer to actually invest emotionally in their employees a lot more than those bottom rungs. So let's take a look at some of these categories that we talk about and that millennials are asking for in multiple surveys. So these surveys include things like Deloitte survey. I have a whole list of references at the end that we'll make available. But when you ask millennials what they're looking for, these things seem to come up more than anything else. Work-life balance. And I assume that any of you who work with millennials and any of you who are millennials are probably nodding your head yes at this point. Work-life balance, 89% of millennials in one study said that work-life balance is the key to happiness on the job. 89%. But when we dig deeper into what millennials mean when they say work-life balance, what's interesting is that their work-life balance is not your grandmother's work-life balance. Their idea of work-life balance is very different. And here's why. Millennials grew up watching their parents, watching the baby boomers strive for work-life balance and fall on their face. Baby boomers had the highest percentage of the highest divorce rate of any generation ever. And so these boomers who were trying to find balance by trying to have it all, trying to, wear their different hats and be a different person at work and at home, and somehow perform at both, they weren't able to find the balance that they were searching for. That's one. The second concern about work-life balance and why I don't think that millennials are actually talking about that old-fashioned type of balance when they talk about balance is that when we used to talk about work-life balance, we didn't have a cell phone in our pocket. There is no balance now. One of my clients adds me in their WhatsApp chat now, and I see the owner chatting like my thing starts beeping, my phone starts beeping in the middle of the night as this guy is asking his general manager on this chat for all of these things. Don't forget in the morning what, and it's like 2 in the morning when he's sending these things. So you can't escape work now. With technology, you can't escape work. If you ignore your cell phone, people assume that you are ignoring your cell phone, not that you're not getting the call. And so work-life balance in its traditional sense doesn't make any sense anymore. So instead, what I believe millennials are talking about when they talk about work-life balance is really work-life integration. What this means is that millennials don't want to wear a different hat at home and a different hat at work. They want authenticity. They want to bring their true self wherever they go. And they understand that work is going to follow them home. And so it's only fair that home can follow them at work as well, that they can take a quick call from their significant other, from their friend, that they can do work from the beach and be on vacation or having leisure time, but also be able to check in and get some work done really quick. They want it all to be one. They want to be able to work and live outside and inside of life at the same time. 81% of millennials said that they should be able to create their own schedules. Is that crazy? What are we rewarding is the question. If you think that it's crazy to give a millennial the ability to schedule to write their own schedule, then you might be thinking a little old-fashioned. It used to be that the person that was rewarded was the guy who was there in the office, first person there, last person to leave. What millennials argue now is that they want to be judged not by process, but by results. If I can come in for a couple hours, go home, take care of my kids, and then log on to work from home at 1 o'clock in the morning and get my work done, and it's good work, why would you stand in my way? If my work is as good, if not better, than the guy who's there 9 to 5, why does it matter if I'm checking in at the office from 9 to 5? We have to start rethinking the way we motivate people and the standards that we hold them to and the way that we judge their performance, not because there's these millennials that want these different things, but because there's new technologies that encourage and allow for those things. So what does this mean to you? It means offering telecommuting. It means allowing people to work from anywhere. It means flex time. It means limitless PTO. And by the way, any of you who have limitless PTO or know somebody with limitless PTO, limitless paid time off, you know those people are at the office more than anybody because it becomes this thing like you don't want to be the guy to overuse your paid time off. But it's a nice benefit to have that we don't care if you're at work. We want the work to be done, period. We're going to judge you based on your results. If somebody is customer facing, okay, maybe they don't have all of that flexibility with their schedule, but maybe get their input into their schedule and allow them to feel a little bit of autonomy in the creation of their schedule. Moving on, growth. Millennials are overwhelmingly interested in development. And as we saw in that previous slide, that was number one. They want to be developed. And this is also, by the way, the number one complaint I hear about millennials, which is they just want to be the CEO tomorrow. They come in and think they run the place. And that is such a frustration for people. But it's equally frustrating for the millennial who wants it all now. They're thirsty for it and they want to grow. They want career advancement. So how do we find a middle ground? Instead of complaining about these darn millennials, how do we give them that feeling of growth? How do we encourage growth and guide them with through growth where they don't feel like they're stagnating, but you also don't have to put them in the corner office as the CEO tomorrow? Well, 75% of polled millennials said that they want a mentor. And so mentors are a great avenue for growth. It's also a great way for millennials to become accustomed to the way that the operations of the organization. But it's also a way, this two-way mentoring that you can offer is also a way for your older workers to learn some of the newest technology out there, the newest processes, the newest thoughts out there from the millennial employees. And when those come together, when millennials are able to learn from Gen X and the boomers, and those older generations are simultaneously able to learn from the millennials, everybody wins. Millennials, Deloitte found that millennials with a mentor are 2 times as likely to stay within the organization. But even more interesting, Sun Microsystems. There's a case study at Sun Microsystems where they set up a mentor system with older workers and millennials. And what they found was that those millennial mentees had a 23% higher retention rate. Here's what's cool. The mentors, 20% higher retention rate. That's incredible. That not only the ability to be mentored, but the ability to mentor someone else was such a great method of engaging these workers at all stages that you saw these workers have significantly higher retention rates. So millennials are looking for career advancement. Let's find ways to develop them. Always be giving them feedback. They want feedback all the time. Always be giving them feedback. The annual review is outdated. Give them constant feedback. That's what they want. It's what they're used to with their technology. They want constant feedback. Give them personal development time. So in my time at the University of Maryland in the IO program, I was in a cohort with a bunch of younger millennials and even older iGen people that belong to those generations. And what I saw was really cool was a couple of these people were going to their employer, having the background in IO psychology. They knew what they needed and knew how to express it. And so they would approach their employer and ask for personal development time. That they would put on the calendar personal development time, and during that time they would learn a new system that the organization uses. They would read the Wall Street Journal. They would do something to develop themselves. And how in the world would that not be a win-win? Not only does this person feel like they're constantly growing and so they don't feel like they're becoming stagnant, but also the organization grows through the growth of that individual. We need to stop thinking about people staying and getting the gold watch and being with an organization for 20 years. That's not the reality of our current business environment. I don't care what stage of life you're in. It's not what we have set up anymore. And instead, I would encourage employers, and do encourage employers, to figure out, okay, maybe we have a 5-year plan. In these 5 years, we're going to get X, Y, and Z out of these workers, and these employees are going to get X, Y, Z out of us. Make it mutually beneficial with an understanding that this is a launching pad, that the person is not going to be here forever. And if you do something like that, you both win. Autonomy or community. So millennials are asking, for autonomy. They want to be able to figure these things out for themselves. They want to problem solve on their own, but they also want community. They want a sense of community. It's interesting. So millennials reported desire for autonomy, but 71% of millennials consider their coworkers as their second family. 88% of millennials want fun and a fun and social work environment. By the way, 60% of boomers agree with this, that they also want a fun and social work environment. So when we look at millennials saying that they want this work-life balance, that they want autonomy, what they're saying is not that they never want to be at work, that they don't want to feel like they are a part of something. They specifically do want to feel like they are a part of something bigger than themselves. They want that feeling of community, but they want to also not have somebody breathing over their neck. They want you to tell them, give them feedback on the other end, but they don't want you to tell them exactly how it needs to be done because they've got the resources, they've got the newest and best methods. So they want you to give them some space, give them feedback throughout, but not dictate how it's done. But they also want to be a part of the community. Finally, millennials want purpose. So millennials are looking at purpose. They want corporate social responsibility is such a big thing right now, or CSR. This is that now with technology, we have this view into all these companies that we do business with. And so we're looking at these companies with a magnifying glass. We want to do business with companies that support our values. And millennials, as well as many other workers, want to work with companies that support their values. We started this by talking about millennials being very driven by advancement and very driven by finances, by money. But that being said, according to a net impact survey, 50% of millennials surveyed said that they would take a pay cut for work that matches their value. It's kind of interesting when you compare this to another study that found that managers, higher educated millennials, were more likely to switch from nonprofit work to the for-profit segment for higher pay. So what this shows you is that millennials, surprise, surprise, are as complicated and complex as all of us, because more than belonging to the millennial cohort, they are individuals, they are people. So with that, adding purpose to the millennials work, it's really about engaging them in the why. Simon Sinek is great with talking about how to engage your employees in the why. I'm also great, a little bit cheaper than Simon Sinek, but millennials want to be connected with the why of what they do and not get lost in the weeds of the what. If you can do that, if you can figure out how to create that work-life integration, how to add this meaning into their work, paying them something competitive, but not being obsessed over that. Instead, listening to what they need, listening and connecting with their intrinsic motivators, you can motivate and retain these millennial workers way better than your competition is doing right now. So thank you guys so much. I know that time is a little bit short, but Jeff, do you want to pause? Do you want to stop for questions at this point?
Yeah, so we have we'll take as many questions as we can. One that's come in referencing Maslow's hierarchy. How do you suggest employers balance their offerings to employees, including healthcare, 401k, pay, and benefits, to meet a diverse workforce to make sure that all groups feel fulfilled? This person is a millennial, and every company I've worked for has been a one-size-fits-all outside of pay. And we saw on the earlier slide that while preferences between ages 25 to 34 change negligibly, they may shift drastically from 35 to 50, 51, 65, and so on.
That is a great question. So these antiquated benefits that are out there, millennials want benefits, and they want financial types of benefits as well. It's not all about these soft, fuzzy things like, tell me why we're here, what's our vision. Those are so important. But at the end of the day, the financial aspect of these things is important to millennials as well and can't be ignored. Organizations need to diversify their benefits in all senses. None of this should be catered specifically to millennials, just as we cannot continue to just cater toward our older generation workers. We need to diversify. So millennials overwhelmingly say that they desire and you guys, as Terp alumni, might appreciate this. They desire benefit programs where their employer will pay off their student loan debt. If you offer that, you will immediately see an influx of millennials coming to work for you. So there are a lot of different benefits that you can offer to everybody. You know, maternity leave, paternity leave would be a lot more relevant to millennials than it would be for boomers. There needs to be the 401k, the great retirement for those boomers, and as well as these other benefits targeted toward millennials, and they need to be open to anyone, obviously, that works. You don't want to discriminate in any way. And those are the financial benefits. The other benefits that we talked about, you know, these fuzzier benefits are also beneficial for all groups. Employers definitely need to diversify their offerings. I hope that answers the question.
Great, and we'll do one more question before we wrap up. David, why do you think individuals of older generations are stuck in traditional ways and against the millennials' way of thinking and working, despite evidence that millennials are bringing more innovative ideas to the workforce and are working smarter?
So in my professional life, I am very much a change agent. As a consultant, that's what I do. I go in because something needs to be changed in a work environment. And I can tell you that even the most positive change, even a change that is being implemented solely for the benefit of the employees, is met with resistance if it is not done right. And if it is done right, it's still met with resistance, just a little bit less resistance. So I think that that's really what it comes down to. People like the way things have been done, and they are resistant to change. We need to be able to open up the conversation. This is partially why that two-way mentoring is so important, because it breaks down those walls and takes away some of the fear of that change and some of the fear of the other. You know, we get into these stereotypes where they start affecting the other and the way we see the other, but also the way we see ourselves. And so we back into our corners, where I saw a recent article that millennials are now dogging on boomers. You know, we need to bring people together for them to be a little bit more open to the change, and for millennials to be a little bit more open to the traditional ways things are done. Change is hard, but absolutely necessary if you want to stay competitive in this VUCA world. We live in a very volatile business environment.
All right, well, thank you very much. This was a really interesting, thought-provoking session. Appreciate you, David, taking the time to present to our alumni. And thank you for everyone for joining us today. A recording of today's webinar will be posted to the Alumni Association website and shared via email later this week. That wraps up for today. We hope you'll come to another Alumni Association event or program sometime soon. Hope you all have a great day, and go Terps.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Jeff, and thanks to everyone for being here. If you'd like more information, here's all my contact info. I'm always open to talk and interested in talking about millennials and so much more.